Welcome to Saga Thing, a podcast that puts the sagas of the Icelanders on trial. I'm John.
And I'm Andy. In each episode, we read a saga, discuss the story, and judge the actions of the characters at the Saga Thing. Now, after yet another brief but wholly unintentional hiatus, I think we're finally ready to tackle another saga.
Absolutely. I think we've chosen a real winner this time.
Well, that's debatable.
Well, I mean, everything's debatable when it comes to tastes.
Now, I happen to enjoy this saga, so I'm going to agree with you here. This one's a real winner.
Then why are you complaining about my phrasing?
I'm just trying to be sensitive about the myriad perspectives that are out there, John.
Oh, jeez. All right, we've only just started this thing and already you're exhausting me.
Yeah, welcome back, right? Well, if you're exhausted already, I don't know how we're going to get through this one, because it seems like we've got an awful lot to say here. So drink deep of that high alcohol content beer you've got there, John, and let's get to it.
Okay. Hit the button so the people know what we're doing this time around.
This time on Saga Thing. One of Iceland's most celebrated skaldic poets, Kormak Ogmundarson, vies for the love of Steingerd, whose lovely feet capture young Kormak's heart and mind. If these two lovers are going to have any chance, they'll have to overcome the meddlesome fool Narfi and his plot to thwart their love. And who could forget Thorveig, the walrus witch who sinks her tusks into the heart of the love affair. Along the way, you'll meet the aged but awesome Bersi the Dueler and Thorvald Tintime, who rival Kormak for the love of Steingerd. This saga has erotic poetry, dueling, romance, dueling, sorcery, dueling, and Scottish giants, but mostly dueling. Will Narfi and Thorveig stop Kormak's quest for Steingerd's hand, or will the reasonably handsome poet get his way in the end? Find out as Saga Thing takes on Kormak's Saga. Oh, great! Another warrior poet!
That didn't sound sincere at all.
I'm sure that our listeners aren't sick of that theme by now.
But this one is Kormak Saga. It's gonna be great.
Oh, really? I'm not used to you being the optimistic one.
What can I say? I'm excited about what this one offers us. For one thing, it's by far the most widely read of the warrior poet sagas, which means we actually have more of a chance to look at some of the context for this group of sagas than we had with someone like Gunnlaug Serpentongue or Hallfred Troublesome Poet.
Yeah, that's true. But Cormac's popularity with readers doesn't mean that scholars are always kind to it. I mean, Diana Whaley points out in an introduction to the saga that, quote, some critics see it as something of a structural disaster. I mean, she's mainly talking about people... She's talking about people who think that Kormak exists mostly as a frame narrative for the poetry, which there's a whole lot of in this saga.
Well, I mean, to varying degrees, that seems to be the near universal opinion. Even Heather O'Donoghue, who generally seems to approve of Kormak, calls it a, quote, patchwork of different kinds of literary materials.
A patchwork? How is that approving?
Well, she says it was a deliberate structural choice by the author.
Ah, well, that's certainly a kinder evaluation than some have given it.
To me, it actually seems a little harsh. I mean, there are definitely some problems with the pacing of the saga, but I think it's got some charm as a story.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it's true that the poetic verses are the backbone of the story. Cormac comes across as a guy who's never caught without a poem when the occasion warrants.
Often more than one poem. I mean, there are 85 total verses of poetry in this saga, and nearly 3/4 of them are spoken by Cormac. I mean, there's barely any prose, right?
Right, so those of you who just can't get enough of obfuscatory skaldic verse-making action are in for a real treat this time.
Who says obfuscatory? Obfuscatory. Alright, look. Kormak may be somewhat more prolific than the other warrior poets, but overall, this saga is pretty typical of the genre. In fact, it might be worth a minute or two to talk a minute or two like we've ever done anything in a minute or two. To talk about these sagas as a group, or at least the reading tradition that's tended to group them together.
All right. Well, I mean, to some degree, the response to Kormak is typical of the genre. A lot of the scholarly response boils down to one camp who focuses on the high quality and historical value of the poetry, and another camp that focuses on the pastiche and uneven nature of the narratives that surround them.
Nicely done, John. That's a very typically academic move. You're laying out the positions of other people from a very safe and neutral position.
That didn't sound like a compliment at all. Don't give away all our trade secrets.
Okay, let's get down to it. What do you think of this thing?
All right. Well, there's no denying that the skaldic tail sometimes seems to wag the saga dog in these texts.
Whatever that means.
You've never heard the tail wagging the dog?
Oh, I know what that means. I just think it sounds funny.
Well, thank you. But we can't lose sight of the structural similarities among the warrior poet sagas. These are stories that are pretty clearly built around a recognized story structure. So the writers aren't just veering from one verse to the next. There's a kind of skeletal form to these stories that helps to shape the narratives.
Yeah, there's certainly a class of reader who sees a clear structural pattern in the warrior poet group.
Well, I don't think there can be any denying that structure exists.
Sure, but some people, they push the idea really far. I mean, for example, Diana Whaley again, she offers a 9-part framework to their plots, and she gets pretty specific about it. Just take one example. In each narrative, the poet loiters around a local farm after falling in love with a woman there, which causes her father to press for a firm marriage commitment, and then a rival for the woman's affection is introduced shortly thereafter, and before the poet's intentions are fully made clear.
And that's one of the sections?
That's just one of them. There's a lot of them.
Jeez. See,
and they actually do match up.
Yeah, no, and it's easy to miss that degree of similarity because the details are different each time, and it's those details that give each saga its own flavor.
Sure, but the patterns are fairly clear-cut and suggest real attention to the shape and sequence of the action.
Well, okay, to play devil's advocate for the poetry first group for a minute, we have to admit, the skaldic verses in these sagas are almost the backbone of the narrative. I mean,
Sure.
Kormak alone produces 64 verses in his own saga, and another 20 verses are attributed to other sources, mostly to his rival Bersi. Without those verses, Kormak's saga would be substantially diminished as a text, just lengthwise, and most of its best writing would be gone.
And yet you keep making me read all these verses for the podcasts.
Well, I just can't get enough of your dulcet tones.
That's understandable.
Anyway, we're looking at devoting an upcoming saga brief to the verses because they are so vital to reading and fully appreciating the sagas as a collection. And it makes sense to pair that with the warrior poet sagas that we're currently working on. As the name suggests, these are men famed for their poetry.
Yeah. Expect that saga brief very shortly. Wink, wink. Now, all verse makers are not created equal. In Kormak's saga, for example, we get some rather incompetent verse making from other figures that serve to set off how well constructed the verses for Kormak and his rival Bersi are, which is kind of a clever move by the author.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's true. Poets, sort of, semi-professional or professional poets enjoyed a certain celebrity in Icelandic culture. So it just makes sense that they'd be disproportionately celebrated in the sagas.
Yeah, but I think it goes beyond that. Poetry and even poets were something of an export commodity for medieval Iceland. I like to talk to my students about this all the time. Mm-hmm. Now, Snorri Sturluson, for example, the
infamous
writer.
Snorri Sturluson.
Oh, yes, of course. Infamous Snorri Sturluson. Do we do that every time? Is that our little thing?
You haven't caught on to this yet?
No. But there were a lot of poets and writers from Iceland who made a name for themselves in the courts of northern kingdoms, like we've seen in all these other poet sagas.
Right, and actually, we know a great deal about this due to the survival of a document called the Skaldatal, the listing of poets, which is appended to one of the copies of the Prose Edda.
Oh, that's right.
It's not much more than a list of well-known poets and their patrons with some notes on their work, but it's vital to understanding the fame that Icelandic poets enjoyed. In some cases, the work hasn't survived, and so it's thanks to the Skaldatal that we even know of them.
Right. But in other cases, saga writers were inspired to build sagas around the poets and their surviving work, or at least poems that were generally thought to have been composed by the poets.
Mm-hmm. Right, and in some cases, that can cause bizarre effects within the story. I don't know if you remember the brief battle in Hallfred's saga when Mar attacks Hallfred with a sacrificial trough.
Only in the most vague possible sense. Why don't you refresh my memory a little bit?
Well, essentially that's it. Mar attacks Hallfred with a sacrificial trough. Amount of context makes it make any more sense than that.
Yeah, that's pretty weird.
Yeah, it is. And it's almost certainly only in the saga because the author needed to explain a reference to a sacrificial trough in a verse attributed to Hallfred. Mm-hmm. But as you were just implying, there's also the problem of knowing whether these verses are even connected to their supposed authors.
Yeah. I mean, there's a fair amount of skepticism among modern readers of the sagas about that. And even the original writers and audience may have understood the verses to be subject to the same give and take of historicized writing that the sagas themselves undergo. Now, on the other hand, some recent study of the metrics of the verses suggests that many of them, especially those attributed to Kormak, Hallfred, and Eöl Skallagrimsson, are likely to have originated in the 10th and 11th centuries.
So, exactly when the poets themselves lived.
Exactly. But, as has been pointed out, that's not the same as saying the poets themselves composed the verses in the heat of the moment like they do so often in the sagas.
Well, I mean, we have to allow a little creative license to the saga writers.
Sure, but you know what? This is turning into a saga brief of its own, so why don't we talk about Kormak's saga and not get too far off topic? What do you think?
Wasn't this your idea?
That's not really important here. Let's get to it.
I'm gonna go back and listen to that part again. I'm pretty sure this was your idea. One last thing before we get underway. For those of you looking for a medium-sized weekend read, Kormak's saga weighs in at 12,956 words, or 1.42 Hrafnkel's sagas.
I can't believe we're still measuring in Hrafnkel's. All right. But it is worth noting that Kormak is substantially longer than the last few sagas we've read, and this is one of the many sagas that begins back in Norway, right, John?
Yeah, and just to confuse things, it starts off with the story of Kormak's grandfather, Kormak.
Oh.
The elder
easy.
Kormak is a successful earl who supports Harald Fairhair in his struggles to consolidate control of Norway.
Wait a minute. This is something new.
Mm-hmm.
Up until now, we've mostly read sagas of men who stood against Harald, or at least those who found an excuse to escape his rule as soon as possible.
Yeah, mostly.
It's important to note that not everyone who ended up in Iceland or as part of the 9th century diaspora was against Harald's kingship.
Mm.
Some of them were alienated by Harald's son Eric Bloodaxe and Eric's wife Gunhild. It's a nice family.
Who we've actually seen a few times in our readings already. Among other things, listeners might remember her as the mother of kings who sides with the psychotic Viking Saki in Hallfred's saga.
I already don't remember that either.
Good lord, man.
There's a lot going on. Anyway. But others in the sagas, they're motivated by new lands, they're exiled from their communities, or they're just adventurous spirits.
So in this case, the elder Kormak's son Ogmund becomes a Viking raider of some fame. But he runs afoul of a rival named Åsmund Ashsides, and the two of them fight a naval battle and a duel, both of which Ogmund wins.
Good for him. And Ogmund even manages to find time to marry an earl's daughter named Helga. Right between the two fights.
Well, he's not one to waste time.
No.
As it happened, he chops off Åsmund's leg in the duel,
Hey,
and in
bloodshed.
doing so, eliminates his rival.
Yeah, I like the pace of this one so far.
Mm-hmm.
We're just getting started, just a few pages in, and we've already got a feud, we've got nicknames, we've got best bloodshed candidates, but we're not all the way done with Åsmund's family yet, are we?
No, not really, but they drop out of the narrative for a long time. One of the things I actually like about Kormak's saga is this careful balancing of story elements.
Mm-hmm.
And this short introduction seeds in a lot of things that are going to be important later.
Yeah, not least of which is the partial inversion of the usual warrior poet story.
Mm-hmm.
Ogmund has a rival who tries to break up his marriage, but he defeats his enemy convincingly and gets the girl. These are two things that his son Kormak is going to have a lot of trouble with.
Yeah, that's a nice point. But of course there's no happy ever after story for Ogmund, since Helga and her infant son Frodi die shortly after the marriage.
Poor fellas.
Yeah, I know. The now widower Ogmund, who rather predictably doesn't like Eric Bloodaxe and Gunhild, set sail for Iceland.
Now there's a brief version of a settlement narrative here, where Ogmund throws his seat pillars overboard to find a place to land, but the important point for us is that Ogmund remarries in Iceland.
Yeah, and this is a more successful marriage. Ogmund marries Dala, the daughter of a prominent man named Onunsioni.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
We've already got so many names happening.
I know.
How can we expect our readers to keep up with this thing?
Well, Onunsioni we've come across before.
Okay, I'm sure they
now,
remember.
Ogmund and Dala have two sons together. Thorgils, who is a gentle and responsible man, and Kormak. This is our Kormak, who has dark curly hair and is much more headstrong than his brother. The boys grow up in relatively peaceful circumstances, and Ogmund dies after his sons reach adulthood. Thorgils takes charge of the farm under the governance of Skeggi of Midfjord, but Kormak is a more restless soul.
So many names.
I know.
Oh well. It's par for this kind of action is, this kind of development. There we go. This kind of development is par for the course with warrior poets, really. We typically get a contrasting figure, often a sibling, to emphasize the hot-blooded character of the protagonist. So, Kormak has his sturdy farmer brother, Thorgils, just as Gunnlaug Serpentongue had his more politically astute and handsomer brother, Hermund, and Hallfred in our last episode had his quiet and ill-fated brother, Galti.
That's true. And like the other warrior poets, Kormak doesn't much like hard work. So, when a whale washes up on shore and needs to be butchered, Cormac sneaks off to go looking for lost sheep with the farm's overseer, Tosti. And honestly, I don't blame him. Flensing a whale sounds like nasty work.
Flensing? Really?
Yeah,
Flensing?
What? It's the process of peeling blubber off a whale.
Oh, sure. Everyone knows that. Tell me, have you been rereading Moby Dick in your spare time?
No. It's one of those words I don't get to use in conversation often enough. I have to take my opportunities when they arrive.
I see. No, incidentally, my parents were at the beach recently in Florida, and
Flensing?
I asked them about flensing because a whale beached itself near them.
Really?
And I immediately asked, who claimed the whale,
right.
Who's going to get the meat and the blubber and all that stuff, and she didn't get my joke.
Well, fair enough. It was
a traumatic event for her for some reason. Anyways, let's get on to Steingerd. It's time to introduce the love interest.
Okay. So Cormac and Tosti spend the night at the farm of a neighbor, Thorkel of Tung. And while they're relaxing in the evening, they see a pair of feet under a door.
Ooh. Now, these feet belong to Steingerd Thorkel's daughter. She's been sneaking a peek at the visiting warriors. And when Cormac sees her shapely feet, he speaks the first of his many verses in the saga. Mighty love has filled my mind, my trollwoman's fair breeze. A necklace sleigh has just presented her instep to me. The feet of that headdress goddess will bring me grief more often than now. Yet of this maid I otherwise know nothing. Now, there are a few obscure references in that verse. There's Troll Woman's Fair Breeze. That's a kenning for mind. Mm-hmm. But on the whole, Cormac's verses are notable for their relatively straightforward nature, especially in comparison with some of the things we saw in the previous episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's even precedent in Norse myth for an observer falling in love with a hidden person based on a glimpse only of their feet. Skadi the giantess in Norse mythology is allowed to choose a husband from among the gods, but she's only allowed to see their feet.
Yeah, that Skadi was a real looker.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, she chooses the cleanest and whitest feet among the bunch, assuming that they'll belong to the shining god Baldur. But they turn out to belong to the sea god Njord, and I guess they're clean and white from being perpetually washed by seawater.
I've actually often wondered about this story. The implication of the text is that the Norse gods are, on the whole, a dirty-footed and yellow-nailed bunch, foot-wise.
Yeah, you'd think she would have recognized the stinky smell of the ocean on his feet, but whatever. Anyway, in this case, Steingerd hears Cormac making verses about her, and she enters the hall. She then tells her female companion that she thinks Cormac's quite the handsome man, apart from his curly hair.
Well, of course, but her friend disagrees, and calls Cormac a dark, ugly, black-eyed thing. But for Steingerd and Cormac, it's love at first sight. And Cormac begins a courtship of Steingerd despite his mother's disapproval.
Now, what's the objection? She's got a comely instep. What more can a mother-in-law ask for?
She thinks that the difference in social status is too great. Cormac's from a successful and well-connected family, and Steingerd's father, Thorkel, is proud but poor.
This is kind of an undercurrent throughout the saga, and it's one of the ways in which Cormac's saga differs from the other warrior poet sagas. There are even some scholars who think that Cormac's failure to marry Steingerd actually comes down to his unwillingness to marry into a family that's beneath him socially.
Yeah.
But it has to be said that Thorkel's a little more than just proud. He's also seriously overprotective.
Well, he goes a little bit overboard in trying to discourage Cormac's attentions to his daughter. Fair enough.
That's not entirely his fault, though. Thorkel's got a friend named Narfi who's whispering in his ear.
Narfi. I hate that dude.
Well, I think you're supposed to.
Yeah.
You see, Narfi's this lazy fool of a man who's probably got an eye on Steingerd himself, but he has no hope to get her, and he often tries to dissuade Cormac from interacting with her. Oh
god, this is priceless. Okay, so here's Narfi's big plan for scaring Cormac off. He waits until Cormac stops by to see Steingerd, then sticks a sausage from a boiling pot under Cormac's nose and says, "As for the snakes of the cauldron, Cormac, what do you reckon?"
What? That's your Narfi voice?
He doesn't deserve any better than that. He's trying to scare Cormac off with a hot dog.
I don't think he's trying to scare him off, do you?
Yes.
I always thought that the sausages are a reference to Cormac's nether region and his desire for Steingerd.
So then the fact that they're boiled and floppy suggests that Kormak is not going to be able to function as a man, or what?
I don't really know. I'm just going for the simple phallic reference. I thought it was a dirty jest.
Sometimes a suet sausage is just a suet sausage, Andy.
Well, of course, Cormac's response to this insult is to smack Narfi with the back of his axe and to call him a filthy-haired, manure-smeared, coal-biting dog.
Honestly, you have to wonder what Narfi thought was going to happen.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe he was hoping that Kormak was afraid of phallic meat or something. Nudge, nudge, say no more. I don't know.
I actually want to start keeping track of Narfi's incompetent schemes, so that's one.
Just one. Apparently, Thorkel isn't done listening to Narfi, though, since their next plan involves hiding Steingerd while Narfi and the two sons of a local witch named Thorveg lie in wait for Kormak. It's good to have another witch in the saga.
Sure.
This one doesn't work out any better, and in fact, it's actually kind of worse. Kormak breaks into the building where Steingerd is, and he spends the day with her. Quite nice. And as he's heading home in the evening, Kormak is ambushed by Thorveg's sons and Narfi, and he kills both the witch's sons.
And Narfi?
No. Narfi dances around the edges of the battle and escapes unharmed, of course.
And just for the record, that's 2 idiotic schemes for Narfi already.
Yeah, he's kind of a clown.
Yeah.
But not the Shakespearean clown that has something witty or
right. Not the in any way clever clown.
No, he has nothing to teach us.
Mm-hmm.
But we should pay attention to some consequences here.
Right.
Thorveg the witch is understandably a little bit angry about Kormak killing her 2 sons, and so she curses Kormak, saying that he will never enjoy Steingerd's love.
Right. And at first, Kormak ignores her. Later, he makes a formal appeal to Thorkel for Steingerd's hand in marriage, and everything seems to be fine. But one little problem after another crops up, and Kormak's interest in the marriage fades. Mm-hmm. And we're told this was because Thorvig worked a spell to ruin their happiness. When the time comes for the wedding, Kormak doesn't even show up, and Steingerd's family begins a legal proceeding against Kormak for dishonoring her.
And it's gotta be said, Kormak's behavior here is pretty awful. He stands her up.
It's true. I mean, Thorvig's spell stops him from enjoying Steingerd's love, but it doesn't say anything about being a jerk and leaving her at the altar.
Yeah. Well, Steingerd's not going to have to wait long for another suitor because, well, Narfi's got a plan.
Here comes idiotic plan number 3.
No, this one might work better.
You'd really think that at some point everyone else would just start chucking rocks at Narfi whenever he opens his sausage hole.
Well, this plan isn't quite as stupid as the others. He suggests a well-respected local widower named Bersi the Dueler. Bersi has a young son from his first marriage, and he's quite open to remarrying.
So how does Narfi screw this one up?
Well, he does tell Bersi that Kormak's out of the picture.
Okay, sure, but that's actually true, or at least it seems likely.
Well, how about the fact that Steingerd doesn't want any part of Bersi and no one thinks to ask her about it?
That's more like it.
Yeah. And then Steingerd sends Narfi to tell Kormak about the wedding, but Bersi's kinsman Vigi the shapeshifter keeps getting in Narfi's way, so he can't get word to Kormak until after the wedding's over.
So, do we think she's trying to get Narfi killed for his partner arranging her marriage to Bersi?
Why? Why do you say that?
Well, okay, because the last time Kormak saw Narfi, they were trying to kill each other. Or at least Kormak was trying to kill Narfi, and Narfi was trying not to get killed by Kormak.
Well, Narfi is a little nervous about having to visit Kormak, and probably with good reason.
Yes.
When he does tell Kormak about the wedding, Kormak smashes Narfi's shield so hard that Narfi's knocked out cold, which seems reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
And Cormac's brother Thorgils has to wake Narfi up so they can get the details out of him.
Well, and when he learns what's gone on, Kormak is so angry about the wedding that he rushes off on horseback without even taking time to kill Narfi properly.
Would it really have been appropriate for him to kill Steingerd's messenger?
Yes. In Narfi's case, yes, it would.
It seems like Narfi's helping him out here.
But no time for that. Thorgils grabs 17 men and charges off after Kormak. They all arrive at the coastal farm of Thorvig the Witch, where they see Bersi sailing away. They can't catch him by sea since Thorvig rents them a leaky boat. Now, would you rent a boat from the woman whose sons you killed and who has cast a spell on you so that you cannot enjoy the love?
It seems like a questionable idea.
So, of course, because the boat leaks, they're forced to travel overland. And by the time they arrive at Bercy's farm, Bercy's had time to call a large force to support him, and so Kormak cannot attack. Instead, he demands compensation for the loss of his fiancée.
Mm-hmm. Bercy's friend Thord Arndisarson suggests offering terms, but insists that Steingerd is under Bercy's control and authority now, and so Bercy agrees, offers his sister Helga to Kormak as a wife in Steingerd's place, and with his brother Thorgils urging him to take the deal, Kormak hesitates for a long moment. Take the deal! Take the deal, Kormak!
Obviously, Bercy's chauvinist attitude is part of the problem, but it's important to note that Kormak's no better. He's treating this almost as a theft of his property. Mm-hmm. But that hesitation is interesting. The saga writer really heightens the suspense here, and the possibility of a simple resolution to the conflict is tantalizingly close.
Yeah, but that's not how sagas work now, is it?
No, of course not. There's a woman named Thordis the Prophetess present, and she shouts out from the crowd that Helga is a harlot and a fool.
Boo!
Boo! Yes, the ancient booer. Bercy's followers try to shout her down, but Kormak considers her intervention a sign. And so instead of accepting the marriage, he challenges Bercy to a duel in 2 weeks' time. Bercy accepts, and the two groups part.
Everyone knows that Kormak's in trouble. I mean, you really shouldn't go around starting fights with guys named the Dueler.
Right.
Bercy's
always
also,
good advice.
Yeah. Bercy's also got a preternaturally sharp sword called Hviting, and he's also got a healing stone that goes with it. In other words, it's just not a smart choice for an enemy.
Well, yeah, and once he cools down, even Kormak is a little worried. So he goes and gets advice from his mom, Dala.
Running to his mommy? Oh. This isn't exactly warriorly behavior.
Well, mothers in the sagas frequently have knowledgeable advice for their sons.
Like, go kill that guy.
Not always good advice.
Yeah.
But they're a valuable source of information. And in this case, Dala has a brainstorm. She sends Kormak to her friend, Skeggi of Midfjord, to ask him for the loan of a legendary sword called Skofnung. Mm-hmm. Now, can I digress for a moment here?
Since when do you ever ask about digressing?
Shh. Now, we've mentioned on the podcast before that some of these weapons have their own history. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the great ones.
Yeah, it is.
The story of how Skeggi got his sword is briefly told in La Namabok. Skeggi was a brave man and a traveler who fought in Russia. When he returned from the east, he went to Saland in Denmark, where he broke into the burial mound of Hrolf Kraki and stole Skofnung, King Hrolf's sword, as well as Hjalti's axe, and many other treasures. But he did not find Laufey, the sword of Bothvar Bjarki.
Wow, that is really cool. Now, seriously, I'm not familiar with that story, so that's really interesting to me. I do know, however, and this will help clear things up for some of our listeners, Hrolf has his own saga. It's called Hrolf Saga Kraka. And it's a rough analog to Beowulf's story. Mm-hmm. And Hrolf himself has a number of great victories, and his sword is a big part of that legend. So Skeggi just went ahead and stole it.
Yeah. So Skeggi just grave robbed Hrolf Kraki to get his sword, and he's not excited about letting Kormak use it.
It's a very special sword. I can understand that.
Well, absolutely. But he does eventually give in.
Oh, sure. But it's not that easy. There are certain rules to using a sword as magical and wonderful as Skofnung. Mm-hmm. Now, we'll let Skeggi himself explain. He says, should he have a silly voice?
He should have a voice. Doesn't be silly.
Well, okay, but
Skeggi's a respectable man.
Let's imagine who he is. What is this guy? Is he old?
He's an established landowner. I believe he might be a Gothi.
Okay. All right. He says, a pouch goes with this sword, but you are to leave it alone. The sun is not to shine on the pommel of the sword hilt, and you are not to wield the sword unless you're getting ready for combat. But if you do find yourself on the battlefield, sit by yourself and draw it there. Hold out the sword in front of you and blow on it. Then a little snake will crawl out from under the hilt. Turn the sword sideways and make it possible for him to crawl back under the hilt.
Unbelievable. First of all, I have so much to say about your choice of voice for Skeggi. But I think Kormak's response sums it up. What will you sorcerers think of next?
Is that a notable witticism right there?
It's a pretty good line.
Yeah. A little snake will crawl out from under the hilt. Really? I can't get over that.
It's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah. And
But
Cormac
honestly,
thinks
in the
way.
end, none of it matters very much, because Cormac's the sort of person who doesn't read the manual.
No, he can't be bothered.
Right, so as soon as he gets home, he tears the pouch off the sword and tries to pull Skofnung from its scabbard.
Dummy.
The sword is so outraged by its disrespect.
Wait a minute. You're saying the sword is outraged?
Yeah. The sword has a mind of its own.
Yeah, of course it does.
Yeah. And that mind is seriously annoyed with Cormac.
Understandable.
Which is not really how you want to start a relationship with a magic sword.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Cormac has a problem with authority figures in general.
Sure. Yeah.
Is this a phallic thing? You have a penis and then the bag hanging off and you rip the bag off?
You rip the bag off, and also, when you blow on the sword, a snake comes out. And that's how the sword gets its power. It's, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, I don't know what to do with it. Let's get back to the conversation here. Yikes!
So it's my line. Cormac continues abusing Skofnung even on the day of the duel, so that the sword is actually screaming in fury at him before the duel even starts.
He's very angry at his penis.
What?
This is getting seriously weird. But I guess this is the moment when we get the dueling rules laid out for us. And if you've already listened to our saga brief on dueling, you'll have heard this long and detailed explanation of the rules for the holmgang, or formal dueling.
Now, I have to say, we treated this scene fairly seriously in that episode.
Yes, we did.
It sort of changes my understanding of it that one of the participants' sword is shouting curses at him the whole time.
No kidding. Well, they don't draw attention to that during the description, though. But briefly, Cormac and Bersi, they have to stand on a cloak together and take turns striking. And their seconds hold shields for them, with each side allowed 3 shields. The first to be disarmed or to shed blood is the loser.
Right. Now, in this case, Cormac's brother Thorgils will be his second, while Thord Arndisserson is going to be the second for Bersi.
Right. Thord is the same guy who tried to arrange a settlement earlier. But I don't remember that myself, so if you don't, that's okay.
Right. And he's also a sort of defensive specialist when it comes to duels. Bersi later calls him the god of the shield in a verse.
That's pretty cool.
He's a very useful guy to have on your side in a duel. Interesting footnote. Our more obsessive listeners may remember way back in Gisli's saga that 2 of Bork the Stout's nephews, Thorod and Outlawstein, were among the men who hunted Gisli down and who were eventually killed by Gisli. This guy, Thord, is their father. He's married to Bork's sister Thordis.
Wow. Very good job, John. That's kind of obscure connecting there.
Well, I do love a spot of family tree trivia.
Me too. Let's get on with the actual duel, okay?
Okay.
All right. It's actually pretty straightforward. Both combatants destroy each other's large shields, and on Cormac's next swing, the 2 swords clash. Skofnung is badly nicked by an iron targe, which Thorveg the Witch had given to Bersi. But the tip of Bersi's sword, Feting, is sheared off and cuts Cormac's thumb open. His bleeding thumb stops the fight, and Bersi claims victory.
These duels always end on a technicality.
Not always, but this is first blood, right? Duel ends on first blood, so there you go. They clearly don't resolve the problem in a satisfying way, though. They really wanted to cut a leg off or kill the person.
Yeah. So that's it? Cormac has to pay a fine and back off?
Yeah. Well, I guess sort of. He promises to pay the fine, but then he stops by his uncle Steinerd's house and tells him to pay Bersi. Meanwhile, Cormac says that he's going to leave Iceland. Just for a while.
Steinar sneers at Cormac a bit, but he says that he'll pay the fine if it has to be paid. Incidentally, this is the same Steinar Onunderson who is reported elsewhere in the sagas as having a fairly significant feud with your thing man Thorstein Ailson. Meanwhile, Cormac's thumb gets infected and swells up, and he refuses offers to heal it until he gets home to his mommy.
Such a stubborn guy.
I know. He also returns the sword Skofnung to Skeggi of Midfjord and blames the sword for his failure in the duel.
He's so funny. So Cormac blames the sword even though he deliberately ignored the rules for using it.
Yeah, Cormac's kind of a jerk sometimes.
Yeah.
But
Most
we're
of the time,
going to get a
really.
bit of a break for him, fortunately, since he's going to pout at home for a while.
Yeah. This is a weird bit. The saga action now switches and follows Bersi for a while. And the story goes through a series of feuds and duels in quick succession. Do you want to cover this, or should I do this?
Well, let's handle them quickly.
All right, if we can.
Well,
we're known for being brief.
There's a first for everything. The next duel is between Bersi and Cormac's uncle Steinar, who offers a double or nothing duel for the fine Bersi's due from Kormak.
Mm-hmm.
That one has a whole subplot in which Bersi's friend Thord Ardisson argues with Bersi after their sons have a disagreement. Thord and Steinar team up to steal Bersi's healing stone necklace before the duel, and obviously Thor is not acting as shield man for Bersi this time. Bersi loses the duel when Steinar's sword slices through the muscle of his buttock and thigh down to the knee. So it's a brutal injury. Steinar is wounded as well, but both men survive the duel. Thord later returns Bersi's healing stone and helps him recover, and the two are reconciled.
That's sweet.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Steinar gives his sword from the fight to Kormak as a souvenir.
Now, the main fallout from the duel is that Steingerd uses Bersi's defeat and injury as a pretext for divorcing him. I mean, she really kicks this guy when he's down. I mean, imagine him suffering from this massive wound on his leg and buttock. And as she's leaving, she says to him, "You were known as Bleary-Eye Bersi, and as Bersi the Dueler. But now you may in truth be called Arse Bersi."
That's a great list of nicknames, but man, that's harsh. What did he do to deserve that?
Now, that's a great question. Jenny Jawkins argues that Steingerd sees Bersi's injury as a humiliation to her, maybe because of the sexual connotations of an injury to the buttocks.
Maybe, but I think you were closer to the truth when you called it a pretext.
Was
Steingerd hasn't been happy about this marriage from the beginning. This is just giving her an excuse to get rid of him.
Yeah, well, whichever it is, I guess. Steingerd instigates the next duel by asking her brother Thorkel Toothnasher, nicknames, to recover her bride price and dowry from Bersi. Now, when Bersi refuses, Thorkel challenges him to a duel. Duel. So many duels in this movie.
I know, really.
It's really hilarious.
Yeah, if you're into duels, this is your saga.
Yeah, there's one duel after another. Thord once again serves as a shield bearer for Bersi, and Bersi kills Thorkel in the duel. Thorkel's shield bearer Vali then challenges Bersi to yet another duel, but Thord intervenes and arranges a settlement whereby Bersi marries Vali's sister Thordis. Everyone following this?
Just trust us on this. The end result is that Bersi gets remarried to his enemy's sister.
Yeah, if you want rewind, get out your pen and pencil, and I guess get out your pen and paper and map this out for yourself.
Right. And we have to say, it is a nice bit of feud resolution by Thord. It helps to clear away any suggestion that Steingerd divorcing Bersi had anything to do with sexual dysfunction resulting from his injuries.
Yeah. This is a great soap opera, isn't it?
It is.
We've got a million different characters, all kind of going back and forth.
All you need is that sort of bad organ music in the background after each moment.
It's great drama. Yeah. Well, anyways, this also leads to a few years of peace, and there's some quiet in the area, which is honestly much needed after all these feuds.
But of course, it's not going to last for all that long.
No, why would it? Otherwise, it wouldn't be interested. I mean, imagine it's just them farming.
Right. Although that could make for a hell of a story.
Steingerd woke up early that morning to milk the cows.
To cast the corn out on the fields. The next trouble occurs after a debate between Odd of Tungu and a fisherman named Glum over the relative merits of Bersi and a local bully named Thorarin the Mighty.
Yeah. Is this our old friend Odd from Henthor's Saga?
Yes, indeed.
Is he my thing man? I feel like he is, but I don't remember.
That's not good. That's not good. Don't ask that question if you don't know the answer.
I think Tungu Odd is one of my thing men.
Oh dear.
He's quite powerful.
You know what? I'm going to count that as a victory for me that you don't even remember who your thing man is from that saga.
Well, I'll just have to check the records.
Nice. I know exactly who my thing man is from that saga. Thord Yeller.
Yeah, he gets shot behind the shed. I'll remind you.
Anyway, Glum likes Thorarin's swagger, but Odd counters by saying that for him, there's no comparison between Bersi's heroism and Thorarin's thievery.
Ooh, them's fighting words.
Yep. Especially after Glum tells Thorarin about what Odd said. Thorarin retaliates by kidnapping Odd's daughter Steinvor, and Odd asks Bersi to help him get his daughter back. Bersi's solution to the problem is to ride alone to Thorarin's farm, where he finds Steinvor and says, "You get ready to leave with me."
That's how he said it?
Yes. He then proceeds to go full Rambo on the household, killing Thorarin and then ambushing Thorarin's 3 sons with spears in the woods near the house.
That's full Rambo?
I think so. I've never actually seen Rambo.
Yeah, obviously not.
Anyway, he then takes Steinvor home with him, and she settles into his household in a kind of ambiguous relationship that Bersi's wife Thordis doesn't like at all. She retaliates by stealing money from Bersi and allowing her brother Vali to farm some of her dowry land.
Right.
Which is not a euphemism in any way, I want to be clear.
Right. So that leads to a final Bersi episode. We'll finally move back to Kormak eventually, won't we?
Right.
We have the now elderly Bersi, his preteen foster son Haldar Olafsson, and the lovely Steinvor secretly plotting to get Vali alone near a cliff. They attack and kill him, and according to Bersi himself, Vali is the 36th man that Bersi has killed in his lifetime. Congratulations. I think confetti probably fell from the heavens. But even the most blood-drenched man eventually has to hang up his sword, and Bersi is now officially retired and out of this saga.
Do I detect in you a bit of Bersi fandom? Are we looking at your thing, man, for the saga?
Let's just say, if I lose the coin toss, yes. He's definitely an impressive guy, though I think the Ars Bersi nickname is, maybe a little knock against it. But that's just a hostile woman.
Right. Speaking of the nickname, the saga now rewinds in time back to Steingerd at the moment when she leaves Bersi and sends her brother Tooth Gnasher on his fatal trip to try to recover her bridal goods.
Mm-hmm. Nice segue.
Thank you. Two
bridal
brothers.
Goods. Sounds dirty.
Bridal goods. I thought farming her dowry land sounded dirty, but you just skipped
That's
right over
even
that.
better. Yeah. It just didn't occur to me. I'm not so filthy as you.
Okay, now two brothers named Thorvard Eysteinsson and Thorvald Tintain now enter the saga at the point when Tintain asks for Steingerd's hand in marriage.
Tintain. So, for people who aren't reading along, let's be clear that this is Tintein, not Tintin, like the kid in the Belgian comics.
Right.
Now, in Thorvald's case, Tintain means something like tin block or tin stick, right? I'm sure you'll explain it in nicknames.
It'll be in the nickname section, obviously. He's apparently some kind of blacksmith. Anyway, Steingerd's family agrees to the match, and she's okay with it too. She actually seems to be on board with this marriage.
Finally.
When Kormak stops by before he leaves to travel abroad, she tells him off and threatens to sick Tintain on him.
I have a hard time taking Thorvald seriously when you keep calling him Tintain, but I think that's part of the...
Sorry, I'm gonna keep doing it though.
Yeah. I think it's the saga author's point though. Tintain, the blacksmith, he's kind of a dirty, swarthy... He's really not a great match. It's supposed to make Kormak look bad.
Yeah.
At least Kormak takes it that way. Anyway, Kormak and his brother Thorgil set sail. And, it's finally, they're getting out of here. In the other sagas that we've done, these guys get out of town fairly quickly. We've been kind of lingering around in Iceland, and Kormak hasn't even been there.
Well, there's this very strange thing in this saga where really for, almost a quarter of its length, it follows Bersi rather than Kormak. And so now we're kind of rewinding back to that early point in Cormac's life.
Right.
Even though we're well advanced in the saga.
Yeah. Now, this is one of my favorite moments in the saga, actually.
Mm-hmm.
While they're sailing, they almost immediately, as they get off the shore, spot a walrus beside the ship.
Of course they do.
Yeah. Kormak suspects something's up here, and he fires a harpoon at it, mortally wounding the poor walrus. Best bloodshed.
Right, but but this isn't just random animal cruelty, right?
No. The walrus seems to be a fetch of Kormak's old enemy, Thorveg the Witch. Now, a fetch is a kind of spirit form that witches occasionally take on in the sagas. And since Kormak kills the walrus, Thorveg falls ill and dies.
So it's not random at all. It's very specific animal cruelty.
I guess if you want to take it that way, sure.
Yes.
Anyway, the brothers make it to Norway, where they spend some time with King Hauken's troop, and they form a raiding partnership with a German named Sigurd. And when Hauken dies, they continue in service to his successor, Harold Greycloak, and they accompany him in a campaign in Ireland, where they gain some fame for themselves in combat. Now, I should say, if it sounds a little bit rushed, that's because it is in the saga as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're not actually blasting through page after page of the saga here. It really is this kind of quick.
Yeah, this saga is less interested in the poet as a king's poet, and much more interested in what's happening in Iceland, which,
absolutely right.
is quite different from what we've been reading. But anyway, throughout all of this, Kormak can't get his mind off of Steingerd, and he composes a number of verses about her.
The surf roars. Steep cliffs rise from the edge of the Sea King's blue realm. To the water's domain glides the din of the sea that encircles islands. Much more sleepless than you, I am made by the wave gleam's Valkyrie. Yet if, having slept, I awaken, it's the bead-decked goddess I'll miss. Now that was relaxing. Well, since Kormak can't quite shake his love longing, these strong feelings he has for Steingerd, he and his brother eventually set sail back to Iceland.
Now, I think we've mentioned before that composing verses about another man's wife is a serious offense in Icelandic law.
Absolutely.
And I don't think anyone else in all saga literature violates that law as frequently as Kormak does.
Probably not. There are a couple dozen verses about Steingerd in the saga, and there's really worse coming.
Yeah, I think we're about to hear the worst of them.
Mm-hmm.
When Kormak returns to Iceland, he finds Steingerd out riding. He manages to lose their horses, and so they have to seek shelter at a small farm nearby.
How convenient. Now, is losing horses the saga equivalent of running out of gas near Makeout Point in the 50s?
I think Kormak hopes it is, but it doesn't quite work out that way.
I just love the subtlety of that idea.
I lost the horses.
The horses seem to have... Oh, my goodness. Oh, are you cold?
As he's sort of slapping away at them as they ride off.
Yeah, go!
Right, but of course, it's actually going to end up being a very awkward situation. Steingerd isn't all that pleased to see him,
Mm-hmm.
and when they find a place to stay, they bed down on opposite sides of a wooden screen.
Yeah.
Kormak then attempts to thaw her with several verses, one of which is particularly raunchy. Would you care to do the honors?
I don't mind if I do.
I figured you wouldn't.
Yeah, he says, now, ladies, prepare yourselves.
Goddess of arms fires, we repose on either side of a screen. The mighty fates have their way and are hostile. I see it clearly. And yet, whenever we share a bed, we have not a care in the world. So dear are you, sea goddess, to the sword of the Love Hare's Island.
Ew, it's kind of creepy.
Now, I think your brandy snifter voice that you gave that didn't help.
I think it's quite appropriate for what he's up to.
I realize that poetic verses can be a little obscure sometimes, but I'm assuming that the sword of the Love Hare's Island doesn't need to be explained to anyone.
Yeah. Let's at least try to preserve it. The littlest pretense of being family friendly. My children listen to this sometimes.
Right.
For some reason.
It has to be noted though that this is really shocking stuff, especially when it's said about and to a married woman.
Yeah. And honestly, Steingerd's not even remotely pleased with this verse. She says at that moment, it would be better if their paths never crossed again. And honestly, I have to say, for a guy who's been pining for Steingerd for a few years, Kormak does a terrible job of trying to win her back.
It's really true, and he can't even blame the witch's curse for this one. The curse only causes him to screw up after he's got Steingerd's love. This is just his own crudeness and lack of style.
Yeah. So in the morning, Kormak tries again. This time he offers Steingerd a gold ring, but she tells him, "May the trolls take every bit of you and your ring."
That's a good line, badly delivered, but a good line. You'd think Kormak would take the hint at this point.
Well, he does kind of, sort of, anyway. We're told that he's now upset with Steingerd and he begins to plot against her new husband. So if you can't win the woman, you just beat up her husband.
Right. But of course he goes home for the winter first.
Presumably to visit his mom again. Not that that's a bad thing.
It's worth noting that Kormak may be the biggest mama's boy ever to get a saga named after him. But at this point, He's so worked up about things that a short visit for cookies and milk is about all he can manage.
It's true. Kormak can't quit Steingerd. Ugh.
You right there?
So lame. He rides to her new home in Svinedal during the winter, and he finds her at home with her husband Tintain and our old friend Narfi.
Narfi. Oh, God, here we go again.
Love this guy.
Why hasn't anyone killed him yet?
Well, sure enough, Narfi starts egging Tintain on, but nothing comes of it. Tintain says he sees nothing wrong with Kormak's visit.
I'm counting this as Narfi's fourth stupid attempt to start trouble, by the way, since he's doing it with Kormak in the room. But of course, Narfi's not going to let it lie there.
Why would he?
He gets Tintain's brother Thorvard on his side, and the three of them hire a vagabond to recite insulting poetry about Steingerd and claim that Kormak composed the verses.
Yeah.
I would have wished Steingerd, that mighty goddess, as an old and proud mare for mating, and myself a stud stallion. Then I'd have leapt on the back of that Valkyrie of threads, whose fiery holes wall halts the battle erect spears.
Oh my God.
Steingerd is infuriated by the verses. But, I mean, as I'm reading it, I have to say that's not any worse than Sword of the Love Hair's Mount that Kormak actually did compose.
Right. I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
I would say Kormak's enemies kind of underestimate just how crude he is.
Right.
And in fact, I would suggest that Kormak's chief cause for anger is that the fake verse isn't actually good enough poetry to be one of his.
Right.
It actually lacks the complexity of allusion and the depth of reference of his usual work.
It's true. For one thing, naming Steingerd outright in the poem misses an opportunity for an unnecessarily convoluted description of some goddess of the sea nymph thing or other.
Right.
I mean, it's pretty amateur, actually.
I'm assuming Narfi wrote it.
Definitely Narfi wrote this. It's so
this,
dirty.
By the way, is the...
I mean, he's the subtle sausage guy, right? What do you think of this sausage here?
Right. And this is his fifth stupid plan. But this time, there's good news for everyone who's as sick of Narfi as I am. Kormak's finally angry enough to do something about him.
Yay. Yeah, Kormak tracks down the vagabond, learns who's behind the fake poem, and then immediately rushes to Narfi and kills him.
Hallelujah! It's about time.
You feel better now?
Yes.
If you dare try to outlaw Narfi,
so much better. Oh, I'm outlawing this guy.
Narfi's not going anywhere. He's so funny.
When I was reading this saga, I was really worried that Narfi was going to get away without being killed.
Well, enjoy your moment.
Oh, I am. Meanwhile, Kormak's still on the warpath. Tintain has to flee and narrowly avoids being killed as well. His brother Thorvard then challenges Kormak to a duel. But when Kormak shows up for the duel, neither of the brothers shows up. Kormak issues his own duel challenge against Thorvard, but composes an insulting verse about him at the same time. So, instead of fighting him, the brothers sue him for slander.
And ultimately, Thorvard agrees to duel with Kormak. Yay, more dueling! But Kormak's mother warns him.
She's still around.
She's always around. She warns him that Thorvard will certainly be using magic, and there's this mommy issue. She tells him to go to talk to Thordis the prophetess.
Now, this is the same Thordis who called Bersi's sister a harlot, right?
Oh, yeah. She's not a nice lady at all.
No.
That's why she's a prophetess.
Right.
She gets involved with some complicated magics to try to help both Kormak and Thorvard, since they're both paying her. At least she's an equal opportunity prophetess.
Right.
But the result is that neither man can be cut by each other's swords.
Now, there's something worth investigating there more generally about which is magic making men's swords impotent.
Maybe. There's a lot of sword penis stuff going on in this saga.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't talk about that. Anyway. Kormak solves the... I guess we just did, didn't we? Kormak solves this problem by hitting Thorvard so hard that it breaks his ribs. He's not technically cut, but he can't continue to fight. Kormak wins, but he's still got a knack for saying and doing things that annoy Steingerd. This time, he wipes his sweaty brow on a flap of her clothing.
Seriously, he doesn't know that's gonna cheese her off.
He thinks he's so slick. Hey, baby. I mean, whatever. I honestly think there's something wrong with this guy. Or else, I mean, at this point, he's more interested in getting a rise out of her than in winning her affection.
That actually might well be the case.
Yeah.
Because he then manages to trade a slaughtered bull to Thorvard in exchange for a ring of Steingerd's, which he correctly predicts will make her even angrier. Then, when Thorvard's ribs have healed, they duel again. Thordis's magic is still working against Kormak, but this time he breaks Thorvard's shoulder blade and wins a second gold ring as a result.
Poor guy.
I know. After that, things quiet down for the winter. But now in the spring, Kormak and his brother plan another voyage. But of course, Kormak can't resist a last trip to Steingerd before leaving, and he kisses her twice while he's there.
Mm-hmm.
Tintain gets angry.
Well, yes, you can see why he would get angry.
Yeah, fair enough. Neutral parties intervene, but Kormak is judged to be in the wrong and has to give Tintain the 2 gold rings that he's gotten from Thorvard.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, since he's Kormak, he speaks a verse for the occasion, and this is actually one of his most famous poems.
I had to pay with a ring both times I embraced the bright brooch bearer with my brown arms. You people paid money before. 2 costlier kisses never came the way of the gold-leafed tree of the sword. Indeed, I am cheated of cheerful encounters.
So we're done here, right? Kormak and his brother leave Iceland, and that's it.
No, of course not. We always do that routine. We're done here, right? But we're never done here. Steingerd.
It always feels like these things should end just a little bit earlier than they do.
Well, you always got to wrap it up with some kind of a little bit of nothing, really.
Right.
My students often complain about that when I'm teaching. They're like, I liked it up until the end. And then it kind of...
I won't spoil it, but those of you who haven't read the saga, we're heading for the most bizarre non sequitur ending in all the sagas.
Well, let's get to it. Mm-hmm. Steingerd and Tintain now travel abroad as well, but they are attacked by Vikings who attempt to kidnap Steingerd. Kormak and Thorgils hear about this, and they set sail to their rescue. But then Kormak kisses Steingerd 4 times, and he gets in trouble again.
This is actually a strange part of the saga. The story almost starts looping on itself here. The price for the kisses turns out to be 2 ounces of gold, and Kormak recites the same verse again while handing it over. Meanwhile, the Viking attack is going to be repeated in a few pages with similar results. So, what's going on here?
I don't know. Maybe a manuscript problem going on here? I mean, from a narrative perspective, this part of the saga gets a little choppy due to staggered repetitions. So I guess we can try to make it as simple as possible. But one thing to say here might be that there's got to be some kind of continental romance narrative influences here, and they're not fully fleshed out just yet.
But it does almost feel like the text got folded on itself somehow.
That suggests, though, that this is an unfinished product.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that this is an unfinished product. It's probably finished. Mm-hmm. It's just not as fully developed as what you'd see in the continental narratives. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we should try to simplify things a little bit for our listeners, and cover one incident in particular.
The bumper boats incident.
Bumper boats incident?
Yes.
Okay.
What would you call it?
Let's see. I guess that would work. Between the 2 Viking attacks, both Kormak and Tintain end up traveling with Harold Greycloak. And while they're sailing alongside one another, Kormak randomly reaches over to Tintain's ship and whacks him upside the head with a ship tiller.
Which is just great.
Tintain is stunned and falls over, but Steingerd, who's on the ship, grabs the rudder and swerves their ship so that it rams into Kormak's ship.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
You've got to respect Steingerd. She's got a lot more spirit than the other love interests we've seen in these warrior.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. She'd probably mop the floor with Helga the Fair and Kolfina single-handedly.
And of course, because Kormak already used his ship's tiller to hit Tintain, he can't recover.
That's so funny.
And so his ship capsizes when Steingerd rams it. He and his men are rescued from the water, but it's pretty embarrassing for him.
But Steingerd's going to need Kormak's help again very soon, because this is where the saga inserts yet another Viking raid.
Right. Now, the second Viking attack is actually much more interesting. The raiders are led by a Viking named Thorstein, and they successfully kidnap Steingerd and try marrying her to one of them. And a little side note here, this Thorstein is the son of Osmund Ashsides, the Viking who once fought against Cormac's father Ogmund.
Is that really important?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's one of those story elements that show how carefully constructed this saga is.
That's right.
Even in spite of the confusion about the repleted plot points. Kormak here faces off against the son of his father's old rival.
Oh, that's actually pretty cool.
Both times with a love interest hanging in the balance. I think we're looking at a somewhat degraded saga, possibly one that has suffered from a transmission error at some point in its development.
Okay.
But a good one.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's very, I never noticed that. Love it. Love it, John. Well done.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the outcome is, of course, slightly different. Instead of a duel like the one Ogmund and Ashsides fought, we have a nighttime raid. Kormak and Thorgil sneak onto the ship when most of the Vikings are on the land. They kill the would-be bridegroom, rescue Steingerd, and return her to her husband, Tintane.
Okay, now that last part is a little different than last time. It's got to be a little emasculating for Tintane that Kormak was the one to rescue his wife.
Yeah, and he knows it. Actually, Tintane essentially admits that Cormac's the better man, and he says that Steingerd should go off with him, since Kormak was the one to rescue her, and clearly loves her a whole lot more. Kormak seems to like the idea, but Steingerd, for obvious reasons, is sick of Kormak and says she won't go with him. I mean, think about all the things that he's done to her. He stands her up at their wedding. He composes horrible poems about her. He steals kisses.
The filthiest verses in all the sagas.
Yeah, grabs her all over the place. She's just not, she's not into it. Anyway, so the two groups part, and Kormak and Steingerd never see each other again. Sad music.
Well, I guess, but I think that's the happiest ending any of the women in these stories has gotten so far.
But the point is, it's a sad ending for Kormak.
Oh, not yet. Kormak's story doesn't end quite yet. First, he spends some time raiding with King Harald. The party visits Norway, Ireland, Wales, England, and finally Scotland in a series of raids. In Scotland, Kormak is chasing some fleeing enemies when he's caught off guard by a Scottish giant rushing out of the woods.
Yeah, that would be surprising.
I suppose so.
Come here, ye wee Viking bugger!
That is also surprising. Is that your Scottish giant voice?
Aye.
Yeah, fair enough.
It is.
Kormak kills the giant, but suffers fatal internal injuries. He does, however, have time and breath for several verses before he dies.
Anger was always my policy, sea goddess. After all, I was famed once for killing, so that the sword would forestall my dying of sickness. In no way can I escape it. Other staves of the battle snake surely must die in their beds. On my heart weighs heavy the pain of death.
Well, it's kind of depressing, but it's a fairly honest self-assessment, really.
Yes, but anger was always my policy isn't much of an epitaph.
No.
Nevertheless, now it's our turn for a little assessment.
Yes, and you will have to wait for that assessment until our next episode, which we will be recording very, very shortly. Promises this time. In the meantime, I don't need to tell you about our website, sagathingpodcast.wordpress.com, where we post our episodes, past judgments, and our thoughts on each other's Thingman decisions. The most important thing, though, that I don't need to tell you, is that our podcast is available through iTunes and pretty much every other podcasting directory you can think of. Please remember to review our podcast and help spread the word. If you don't see us on your favorite directory or you've got something to say, we're on Twitter at SagaThingPod and on Facebook at SagaThingPodcast. And if you're old-fashioned and prefer the 90s way of doing things, just hike up your flannel sleeves and drop us a line at sagathingpodcast@gmail.com. There are so many ways to get in touch with us, it's simply astounding. As always, we appreciate your support. Until next time.
Bye for now. Our best work is still ahead of us.
That's our motto.